Okay, so in order to look at aggregate demand, we need to add investment to our consumption function. And so we're going to say that investment is not dependent on output. That's not exactly true in the data, but investment is often going to depend less on current output, current demand, as on future demand, right? So if firms feel like, oh, people really like our products, they really want to buy our products, then they're going to invest more now. And so they're going to be worried more about the future than the current level. And then we're going to think about what equilibrium looks like. So let's build this up one piece at a time. So what we have now is output on our horizontal axis and aggregate demand, right, which we said is C plus I plus G plus X minus IM, but we're just looking at C and I right now, so it's just going to be C and I on the vertical axis. And so we can think of the horizontal axis as how much we produce and the vertical axis as how much we buy. That 45-degree line is going to be whenever those two are equal. And we'll see that when they aren't equal, then we're going to be pushed back towards equilibrium. So if we're spending too much, firms are going to produce more. If we're spending less, firms are going to produce less. So what we had so far from consumption is our consumption function, which is equal to autonomous consumption plus the marginal propensity to consume, C1, times output. And so that's just a straight line with a slope that is less than 1. So remember, the 45-degree line has a slope of 1. Our consumption function has a slope less than 1. And that's actually kind of important for our model. Now, on top of our consumption function, we're just going to add some amount of investment. And we're going to talk a lot about what investment depends on. We're going to talk about interest rates. We're going to talk about confidence. We're going to talk about future expectations. But right now, we're just saying it's a fixed amount. And so all that does is shift up our consumption function by some amount I. So now that our aggregate demand is C0 plus C1y plus I. And so our intercept over here is C0 plus I, but the slope is exactly the same. It's still equal to C1, which is the marginal propensity to consume. So what happens when something changes, right? We can see if we go back that our equilibrium here is A. This is going to be where output is equal to aggregate demand, and there's our equilibrium, okay? But we know from chapter 12 that the macroeconomic equilibrium is often changing, right? We go into recessions, we go into expansions. And so how does that work? Well, we're going to walk through this, and we're going to see that there's something called the multiplier. And the idea behind the multiplier is that changes in aggregate demand have both a short-term effect and then a longer-term effect. And the multiplier represents this larger change. And we'll talk about how big the multiplier is and how significant it is and why it might be different in expansions than recessions. So let's sort of walk through this, and then we'll do an example of the multiplier in the Great Depression. So let's say that we are at some equilibrium output A, where output is equal to aggregate demand. Well, what happens when businesses decide, you know what, I don't think we really need to invest because we don't have any good ideas, future demand doesn't look very good, and so they decide to invest less. And so I prime decreases by 1.5. Well, all right, well, so remember, investment is part of aggregate demand, and so when investment falls, aggregate demand falls. In this case, we have a decrease of investment of 1.5 billion euros, and so investment falls by 1.5 billion. Well, if we move over now to our point where aggregate demand equals output, now we are at point C. Well, this means that income is actually lower, right? Remember, income was here, and now we've moved to the left to point C, so income is lower, and we know that when income is lower, people will spend less. And so they're going to spend less because they have less income, and that's going to drop us to point D. And then we'll move over again to the 45-degree line. Okay, that's how much output is equal to aggregate demand. well, now we've dropped income again, and so people are going to spend less again. And eventually we're going to get to some new equilibrium. Notice that each of these steps is smaller and smaller, and that's because the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. And so our new aggregate demand function is dropped by 1.5, but output actually falls by more than 1.5, and that's because of the multiplier effect. In this case, the output fell by 3.75 instead of just 1.5, and so you can see the multiplier is equal to 2.5, and that's because of the marginal propensity to consume. When the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.6, the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6, or 1 divided by 0.4, which is equal to 2.5. And so in this case, 1.5 billion times 2.5 is 3.75 billion. It all depends on what the marginal propensity to consume is as to how big that multiplier is. There's a lot of debate in macroeconomics. Is the multiplier bigger than 1? Is it less than 1? And we'll talk a little bit about why the multiplier might be smaller during expansions. So in this case, in order to figure out what the multiplier is, you just take the total change in real GDP, which is 3.75, divided by the initial change, which was 1.5. 3.75 divided by 1.5 equals 2.5. So let's look at this in the Great Depression. So remember, the 1920s were a time of really fast growth, right? It was called the Roaring 20s, and GDP reached a peak of $324 billion in 1929. Then we had the initial fall in aggregate demand, right, due to the stock market crash and the financial crisis that followed. And so that brings us to point B, right? But at point B, people have less income, right? And that's going to be important because when they have less income, that means they're going to spend less. And remember, in the Great Depression, there's no system of unemployment benefits. There's no safety net for people who lose their jobs. And so that led the economy to fall all the way here to point C, where the 1933 trough, right, that's the bottom of the recession, the trough at the bottom of the Great Depression in this case, was 206 billion. And so you can see we had a big drop in GDP, which took about 2.5 years to reach its bottom. It took even longer than in the Great Recession, which took about 18 months, which was long by most recessions. And so it took us a long time to figure out both, sort of what the government could do to get us out of point C and back towards point A. And frankly, we didn't really recover until the government started spending heavily in preparation for World War II.